What is going on, guys? I've been working on my Necromancer, and I was able to push my Necromancer to level 100 in just about 8 hours. This Golem Minion Necromancer build is insane, and it's based off a lot of the Golem builds like Nick 2's build, but if you haven't built a Necromancer yet, this is the one you want to be running because it not only gives you a ton of easy damage, but allows you to speed farm and easily farm all of the content in the game up to even tier 100 of the pit without really much setup or masterworking at all. It allows us to not only be super tanky and survivable, but allows us again to dish out a ton of damage through our golem and through our minions without much second thought, and again with not much of a setup. And the uniques that can help make this build really good are very easy to obtain, and you get them easily throughout playing and leveling the character. I'm going to run you through how this build is set up, and if you finish the whole video, hopefully you should have no questions about how the build works and understand just about everything about it. Now really quick, I'm going to go over how this build works. Essentially how the build primarily works before we get into all the skills is we use our Bone Storm so we get a ton of DR. We then can curse enemies with Decrepify on the ground and give a bunch of buffs this way. We can use our Blood Mist to make us invincible, and then our Corpse Tendrils allows us to pull in a ton of enemies at once, make every single enemy vulnerable, and then we'll consistently spawn skeletons for more damage buffs and just wreck people with our golem for massive amounts of damage. I'll go over the full rotation at the end, but let's get right into the skills. So first we're going to start with the skill tree, but in the link in the description, the full build planner is there in case you want to take a look at it and save it as a quick reference guide. It has everything from skills to gear to stats to every single thing you can imagine, and I'll update it as I build out the boss killer build and the total min max versions. So first, for our basic skills, we're going to be taking Reap. Reap is going to be our basic skill early on, and then we're going to take Enhanced Reap into Acolyte's Reap. Now, for our core skills, all we need here is the Hued Flesh passive. This is going to make it so our damage has up to a 12% chance to create a corpse at the target's location. And this chance is actually doubled against bosses and help us get bonuses for spawning corpses in, which I will go over in here in just a minute. Now next, for our corpse skills, we're going to want to take 3 out of 3 for Blood Mist. Blood Mist is a skill that allows us to become immune for 3 seconds. This is sort of our safety skill. And Enhanced Blood Mist, casting a skill that overpowers, reduces the cooldown of Blood Mist by 2 seconds. And then also Ghastly Blood Mist, it will leave behind a corpse every 1 second, again giving us more corpses to work with. Spiked Armor, which gives us thorns, and then 15% additional armor. 3 out of 3 for Skeletal Warrior Mastery, and then some bonuses on your gear are very important, so that we increase the damage and life of your skeletal warriors by 90%. And then 1 out of 3 for Grim Harvest, so consuming a corpse generates 2 essence, and 3 out of 3 for Fueled by Death, so you do a 9% increased damage for 6 seconds after consuming a corpse. And we're going to be consuming corpses consistently, giving us this 9% increased damage buff almost every single second. So next, for our curse skills, we want to take 1 out of 5 for Decrepify. This is going to be something you cast repeatedly and curse the ground, so that way enemies afflicted by Decrepify are actually slowed by a large majority and deal less damage overall. Now the modifiers here mean Enhanced Decrepify. Unlucky hit enemies hit while afflicted with Decrepify have a 10% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds. This allows us to get extra damage to stunned enemies when we proc that on some of our gear. And then Abhorrent Decrepify. This is the big one, and this is what helps make this build so good. Unlucky hit enemies while afflicted with Decrepify have up to a 15% chance to reduce your active cooldowns by 1 second. That doesn't seem like a lot, but when you pull things in with Corpse Tendril and consistently hit them while they're cursed with Decrepify, you're going to see your cooldowns consistently run all the way down to 0 within like 1 or 2 seconds of casting them on any big mob pack. So this reduces our cooldowns like insanity. Now we also want to take 3 out of 3 for Amplify Damage. You deal 16% increased damage to cursed enemies. Death's Embrace, you deal 6% damage to close enemies and take 12% less damage from them. 3 out of 3 for Death's Approach, so you get movement speed. You can change this to something else later for more damage, but right now I like this for speed farming. And 3 out of 3 for Skeletal Mage Mastery, so you increase the damage and life of your skeletal mages by 60%. Next, we'll come down here and take 1 out of 5 for Corpse Tendrils, which makes speed farming and stuff very easy. And again, there's a specific way you should run with these skills, which I'll talk about in the rotation section. So you want to also take Enhanced Corpse Tendrils, so enemies who are in range of Corpse Tendrils are actually slowed before they're pulled. And then Plagued Corpse Tendrils, so that way enemies damaged by Corpse Tendrils are actually made vulnerable. Again, that way you get to take advantage of making enemies vulnerable as soon as they get pulled by Corpse Tendrils, again upping our damage by a ton. So also you want to take 3 out of 3 for Necrotic necrotic carapace. So when a corpse is formed from your skills or your minions, you actually gain Fortify for 6% of your max lifetime, allowing us to keep up that automatic DR buff that Fortify gives us. Also, you want to take 3 out of 3 for Bonded in Essence. So every 8 seconds, your Skeletal Priest healing will heal your skeletons for 60% of their max life. This keeps up all of their health. 3 out of 3 for Inspiring Leader. So while you're healthy, you gain 12% increased crit strike chance, and your minions get 18% boost to theirs. And 3 out of 3 for Hellbent Commander. So your minions deal 45% increased damage while you are close to them. We also want to take 3 out of 3 for Golem Mastery. Golem Mastery and Hellbent Commander are going to be one of the things you want bonuses on your gear for, especially Golem Mastery, because this is going to increase the damage and life of your golem by 125%. If you only have this 3 out of 3, I believe it's 75%. But again, the more points you have here, the more points your golem is doing in terms of big damage hits, which is what we're really looking for. And then finally, we want Bone Storm. Bone Storm is going to give us barrier and damage reduction. So it gives you 15% damage reduction while up, which is a huge buff. And then you also get critical strike chance increased by 20% while it's active as well. And with our cooldown reductions from all of our other skills, you should be able to keep this on basically infinite no cooldown, meaning you can cast it and then maybe have to wait like 5 seconds and then you can cast it again. Gives us a consistent 15% DR and a consistent 20% crit strike chance. Almost no skill can beat that, especially if the cooldown reduction is very low. Then also we want Shadow Blight, the key passive. This is a big part of the build. So next we'll touch on the gear very quickly. Ideally, I'm going to go over the aspects first and then all of the gear stats later. Again, all that stuff is detailed in the description. But first, we're going to start with our aspect on our helmet. We're going to be taking the aspect of Shielding Storm. This is going to give us, so each time Bone Storm damages an enemy, you get barrier equal to a certain amount of base life for 10 seconds, allowing us to almost stack infinite barrier, helping us be more tanky in the late game. And then also we want the aspect of Hardened Bones. So you and your minions gain 22% increased damage reduction. This is a big one for survivability. For our gloves, we want the Aphotic aspect. So our Skeletal Priests empower your Skeletal Warriors attacks to deal shadow damage and have a 13% chance to stun enemies. Then for our pants, you can have any pants you want, but once you get the unique pants, which are fairly easy to get, you want to use the Blood Moon Breaches. So enemies have a 5% chance to curse enemies, and enemies affected by at least one of your curses take 70% increased overpower damage from you, which is a huge boost, especially from getting hit with your golem. Next are the boots. So we have the aspect of Occult Dominion. This makes your maximum number of Skeletal Warriors and Skeletal Mages is increased by 2. Again, since we're focused on scaling the Golem, earlier on in late game, this is a perfectly fine aspect, but can be replaced later if you want. And then we're going to be using Aspect of Ultimate Shadow. You can see it makes our Bone Storm skill deal shadow damage and gain the following additional effects. For our focus, we want the aspect of Inner Calm. This helps especially since we're going to be standing still most of the time, giving us a 10% overall increased damage buff, but tripling the bonus up to 30% if we're standing for 3 seconds. And the way we run this build, we can stand still and get this bonus very, very often. Next, we can use any ring you want, any ring at all. But right now, if you find the Ring of the Sacrilegious Soul, especially for speed farming, it honestly makes speed farming a little less labor intensive because it automatically raises skeletons, corpse explosions, and corpse tendrils every 1, 1, or 8 seconds if you get the perfect roll, allowing us to not have to focus so much on the mechanics of every fight, since those are all basically bonus skills that don't really cost you anything. And then we use Aspect of Frenzy Dead. This is a big one. So each time one of your summoning minions damages an enemy, they gain 14% attack speed for 3 seconds, up to 45% attack speed. So our minion attack speed helps to scale our overall damage very, very high. So the higher this is, the higher you want it. And then the Blighted aspect. So you deal a huge percent increased damage amount for 6 seconds after the Shadow Blight key passive damages enemies 10 times, which it will almost consistently, again giving us a huge damage buff. So the highest damage percentage you can get here gives you a huge damage bonus right out of the gate just for having this on your amulet. Quickly I'll touch on all the stats you want, but all the best stats are going to be in the build planner. Ideally for our helmet, you want intelligence, max life, and cooldown reduction. You can put the Skeletal Warrior passive buff on our pants or some other piece of gear. Gives our skeletons more life and more damage. And then you want to temper max life and up to a 15% chance to stun enemies for 2 seconds onto your helmet. Then for our chest, we want intelligence, max life, and Golem Mastery ranks, specifically a greater affix for Golem Mastery ranks, because the higher you buff that, again, if you look via our skill tree, the more points you get for that passive from that piece of gear, it increases the damage and life of our golem, which is our primary damage source. So you want to make sure you have that, and temper max life and corpse tendril size on our chest as well. And then for our gloves, we don't have a perfect setup here by any means, but you need armor on at least one piece of gear to hit that max armor cap of 9,253 or whatever it is. I just decided to put that on my gloves, but ideally you want attack speed, critical strike chance, and intelligence, all three of those with an emphasis on attack speed for dealing more damage. And then tempering golems damage and corpse center size or crowd control duration. Ideally, I like corpse center size to get the most amount of enemies into a group as I can. I feel like it just makes it a little bit easier. Ideally for our pants, again, we're using the Blood Moon breeches. For our boots, you can have armor, but if you have it on another piece like our gloves, you can actually get rid of that and re-enchant it, as well as movement speed and intelligence. Now later in the game, you can go for max life instead of movement speed, but I like movement speed to help us move around the map much quicker. Again, just helping for farming those higher levels a little bit faster. Now for our weapon, we want intelligence, we want max life, and we want crit strike damage, just like you can see here. Again, that helps scale our damage to absolute most. And then we want to temper minion attack speed and golem damage here on our one-hander. And then for our focus, we want max life, crit strike chance, and instead of maximum resource, ideally you want cooldown reduction to buff with our automatic 7% cooldown reduction it gives us to again help keep our skills up every single second of the day, and temper bone storm duration and golem damage on our focus. And then again, you can use another ring here, but Ring of the Sacrilegious Soul is best for initially farming. And then for our other ring, you want crit strike chance, attack speed, and max life. Those three are the primary ones, but if you get intelligence, that's perfectly fine to help scale some of our damage. But ideally here again, you want a greater affix for attack speed to help us buff our damage via our attack speed much easier. And then you want to temper golem active cooldown reduction and golem's damage to help keep our golem ability up almost non-stop. And then for our amulet, we want attack speed and cooldown reduction, as well as critical strike chance. Now you can swap out critical strike chance if you get the Hellbender Commander passive bonus. If you get that, throw this on here instead of crit strike chance. Either way that works, but the Hellbent Commander passive is ideally the best, I think, in slot for this build. It's just a little bit harder to get. Now you also want golem active cooldown and golem damage tempered on this weapon as well to help scale our golem yet again, giving us a ton of damage for our actual golem himself. Now again, if you follow all those stats and stuff in the build planner, you'll be running tier 80, tier 100, even plus with your Necromancer in terms of the pit. Very easy. And you can also be running those uber bosses solo. Now for our Book of the Dead, we're going to be using, for Skeletal Warriors, we're going to be using the second option for Reapers. This is going to give us a 15% chance to carve the flesh off enemies forming a corpse, giving us consistent corpse generation very easy. Now for Skeletal Mages, you also want, for a Shadow, you want to deal 3% increased damage for each active Shadow Mage. And then for our golems, for blood, you want the second option. So when a blood golem heals itself with its active ability, you're actually healed for 5% of max life for each enemy drained. This can basically heal us non-stop with big packs, giving us max health almost all the time. And then while your blood golem is actually healthy, they get 25% damage reduction and increased damage, scaling our golem's damage almost out of the roof. Now for our Paragon board, we have this set up very close to Nick 2's board, but I'm going to show you some of the nodes you can be taking to focus on, again, our max life, sustainability, and stuff for endgame. So ideally you want to take in our starter board this stuff for max life right here, as well as the resistance to all elements, making us really not need much resistance at all for this build, as well as the max life nodes over here as well. And then here we want to take the Scourge Glyph. This is going to scale our shadow damage over time, as well as you and your minions deal 10% increased damage to enemies affected by shadow over time effects, giving us overall big damage buffs right out of the gate. Now once you beat that, we're going to come up here. Next, for our second board, we'll jump up here to the Hulking Monstrosity board. Eventually, we want to take this node so our golem gets increased life and increased damage. This is obviously a big one for our golem damage. And then we want to slot in the Dead Razor glyph here, so we get bonuses to all of the Paragon nodes around us, specifically the big golem damage nodes that are right here. Also, when your minions deal damage to an enemy, the enemy takes 1% increased damage from you and your minions up to 15% for 10 seconds. This is an awesome glyph buff, but again, the node bonuses is primarily the big thing here. This is going to make it so our golem damage right here gets a big buff, as well as our golem damage here and here. You also get damage while golems are active up here in the left, as well as down here in the bottom left. And being our second board, we meet all of the bonuses this way, so we max out our overall golem damage that this board will actually give us. Now keep in mind, as you scale this build into infinity, you can actually consider taking potentially some of these other passives and scaling over here to this other golem damage section to help boost our damage even more. But currently, for running higher tiers of the pit and speed farming, I ideally don't like to do that, but this could really benefit your golem damage down here if you decide to come over here and take it. And essentially, instead of going this way, you could scale your board out this way, allowing you to not use that many extra nodes and take some of these down here for the additional golem damage. Now, ideally for our third board, we're going to be taking the Scent of Death board. So that way, once you take this node with at least 2 corpses nearby, you get 15% damage reduction, making it good for survivability. But with no corpse, you actually deal 15% damage, allow us to generate corpses a little bit quicker via the extra damage. Now you want to take the Golem glyph here so you get additional Golem damage, and then come up here and also take the additional Shadow Resistance and additional max life nodes for the additional overall health. Now down here on our fourth board, we're going to be using the Flesh Eater node. This is going to be one of the big ones we proc consistently. So that way in battle, when you consume 5 corpses, you get 40% increased damage for 6 seconds. We're going to be proccing this non-stop, consistently spawning in corpses to make sure we're getting this buff. And then for our glyph, we're going to be using the Amplify glyph, so we get 150% bonus to all the magic nodes here and here within the area. And then you also get enemies affected by curse skills take 10% increased damage from you and your minions, giving us a nice little damage bump. Now for our fifth board, we're going to be taking the Cult Leader board. This is going to make it so our minions deal 30% increased damage for each 20% of attack speed bonus up to a maximum of 100% attack speed bonus. Now we can scale our minion attack speed to essentially allow us to basically get 150% increased damage over time with this Cult Leader board. With this Cult Leader node, now we're going to be taking the board here for Exploit, so we deal more damage to vulnerable targets, and dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases our damage done for 6 seconds up to 10%. This greatly helps with our damage to vulnerable enemies that we proc via our corpse tendrils, and then a couple other things here for damage reduction for your minions, summon damage, and minion attack speed up here, which is going to be a big one for scaling our overall damage. And then finally for our sixth board, we'll be taking the Bloodbath boards, but ideally we just want this so we can socket our Essence glyph here. This is going to give us increased critical strike damage, and crit strikes deal increased damage to enemies that are not healthy, which is a good damage buff to have. And then we want to take some of these nodes over here for hardened, etc., so that way we get some additional damage and crit strike damage this way. So one thing I will note before I show you the rotation, again, the Ring of the Sacrilegious Soul gives us automatically roasted skeletons, and again automatically cast corpse tendrils every 8 seconds. So sometimes if you're going to cast corpse tendrils, it can again automatically cast one for you, allowing you to take advantage of that every 8 seconds or very quickly. So sometimes you don't have to worry about casting corpse tendrils, so keep that in mind if you see multiple corpse tendrils that I'm casting, because it makes life a little bit easier. The basics are, as soon as you get a big pack of mobs, ideally you want to right click to use your golem's active ability and click it on an enemy, like an easy enemy to beat. Your golem's then going to run in, hit that enemy and kill it, leaving this corpse on the ground. Next, once this is on the ground, you can then cast corpse tendrils on it, and it will then bring in all the enemies and start to make them vulnerable. If you follow that at the beginning of every fight, you're going to be bringing in all of your enemies together very quickly at the very beginning without having to cast corpse tendrils and figure out where a dead body is. Next, you're going to cast Decrepify on the ground right there where it's pulling them all in, and also cast your Bone Storm if you need it for the damage reduction as well as the increased critical strike chance at that point. So all the enemies should now be pulled in together, vulnerable, and you should be getting those crit strike chance buffs. Again, following those 3 steps in every fight will ensure you get all of your enemies in a tight little pack to just start wailing on almost instantly. And then the final part is making sure you consistently spam your raised skeletons. We want to make sure we consume 5 of these corpses, and that's why you want to be spamming, because if you consume 5 corpses, then you actually proc Flesh Eater, your legendary node, for 6 seconds, which again shows us when consuming 5 corpses, you get 40% increased damage. So as you continue to raise more skeletons, you proc this for 6 seconds, giving you a huge damage boost. And then you can wait for a second, but if you feel like you're going to need to spam them again to proc it again, you can continue to do that, again giving us a huge damage boost. So this is a huge part to make sure we up the amount of damage that we really should be doing. And then finally, you'll just spam your Golem ability, so your active Golem ability using whatever your keybind is on the actual enemy group. This is going to give us tons and tons of damage, and with our cooldown on all of our gear and skills, etc., you should be having almost a 0 cooldown on Golem at every single moment, allowing you to cast it consistently over and over and over and over again non-stop for massive damage. So again, I'll show you what this looks like real quick. Once we jump in and find a mob pack, we're going to cast our Golem, get a corpse immediately on the ground, use corpse tendrils, cast our Bone Storm, Decrepify on the whole group, and then consistently spam our raised skeleton while we're using our active Golem ability, allowing us to again just dish out massive amounts of damage. When we jump in here again, use Golem on an easy enemy to defeat, corpse tendril on the ground, pull them all in, Bone Storm and Decrepify right here, and then again spam raised skeleton and our Golem ability, allowing the Golem and the minions to just mow through enemies. Again, we'll use our Golem ability, our corpse tendrils to pull in, Decrepify, and then spam skeletons while we're using our active Golem ability. And again, as long as you stay still and back away from the fight, this means you're getting your big damage boost from our inner calm aspect, giving us 30% increased damage because we're standing still for 3 seconds. If you follow that in the build planner in the description, this Golem build can beat every piece of content in the game. That being said, if you guys enjoyed, drop a like on the video, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.